I hope to provide you with somewhat of a foundational knowledge of some of the tactics we use for invasive plant management, because a lot of these tactics are going to be similar based on the life cycle of the particular species you might be wanting to deal with. And tactics are going to be similar, like if you have an annual weed, you're going to focus more on reducing seed production, whereas a lot of you may have some of these perennial vines, trees, perennial species that are a little harder to control, that may take a little more effort and management over time as opposed to a single year. So I did want to talk a little bit and get some clarification on some terminology we have or haven't heard. We might refer to unwanted plants as weeds. We might refer to our unwanted plants as invasive species or noxious weeds. So again, just a little bit of clarification on some of the terminology that we're using. So a weed is generally a plant that causes economic losses or ecological damage, can create health problems for humans or animals, and weeds are, of course, undesirable where they're growing. Things like, crabgrass, foxtails, lamb's quarters. Now, an invasive plant can be considered a subset of weeds that have the potential to be more damaging than ag weeds because they compete with natives in undisturbed natural areas. And within those two categories, we also have a noxious weed, and that's a plant that's designated by a federal or local officials as something that's injurious to public health, agriculture, recreation, wildlife, or property. Once a weed is classified as noxious, this gives authorities the right to implement quarantines or take other actions to contain or destroy the weed and limit its spread. Noxious weeds can be both just regular agriculture weeds or invasive weeds like Johnson grass. Another way to think of the differences between just a common agricultural weed and invasive weed is to look at these four attributes. For one thing, introduction. Most agricultural garden weeds are introduced accidentally. Invasive plants, however, can be introduced accidentally, but most were likely introduced intentionally. Think about some of the invasive plant species you might be aware of, things like Callary pear, beautiful tree, introduced because it was easy to grow. Multiflora rose, another thing, beautiful plant, introduced, was easy to grow, became invasive. Another thing is disturbance. Generally, ag and garden weeds require some type of human disturbance to become established and thrived. Invasive plants certainly can benefit from this disturbance, but it's not essential. Again, they do have the ability to outcompete native plants in natural areas. Persistence. Most garden weeds, ag weeds will not persist without some type of human disturbance, such as like tillage and irrigation. And life cycle. Ag weeds are primarily annuals and herbaceous perennial species. Invasive plants tend to have different life cycles. They can be annual, perennial, or biennial species. So some of the challenges with managing invasive plants versus just common agricultural weeds is when we look at an agricultural setting, such as this corn crop seen on the left hand of your screen. We're really worried about managing all the weeds in that corn and leaving the corn standing. But if you're in a forest or other natural area type setting, your concern is probably managing one or two invasive plants and leaving the natives or the desirable species present. So I'm going to get into some tactics for just an overview of different tactics for managing some invasive plants. First, education and prevention of these native species. We've got public education like we're doing now, can significantly reduce the introduction and spread of invasive and undesirable plants. Some good resources for finding more information about invasive plant species are the University of Florida Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plant and Invasive Species website, cleango.org and invasive.org. And with this, it's really important to understand, what kind of species you might have, and its biology and the ecology of the intended target, because depending on what species you have and how long it's been present, it's going to affect how you manage it. If we look at this chart of an invasion curve, prevention is the first step in managing an invasive species. If it's not in an area, then it's a lot easier to control once you see it. But as far as your level of management, if you're trying to eradicate a species, that's gonna have to happen early on with small localized populations that you can quickly manage over time. But in some cases, containment and long-term management are really going to be your only options. And when we talk about containment, we're just talking about, decreasing its spread and hopefully increasing the populations of native plants to help keep that invasive species at bay. Because again, as this invasion curve increases, then we really don't have, then eradication is not going to be an option. So whenever I give a presentation about weed control, I like to talk about integrated weed management. And this involves not only using chemical approaches, but biological, mechanical, and cultural tactics as well. Biological control has been used to manage some invasive species. And for those of you who are not familiar with what biological control is, this is the introduction of reproducing populations of foreign insects or diseases that are host-specific and provide suppression of the target weed. Suppression being the key word there for biological control, because in order for you to have a biological control like an insect, you have to have that target weed to support it. If you happen to have an insect that eats all of your is able to eat all of your invasive plants, then think about it. There's no more food source for that insect to survive. So there has to be that balance between invasive plant and biological control. Problem with these biological control measures is they often take years to establish, and it's not really practical where eradication is desired. Again, you have to have a host to support that biological control agents. Some good characteristics of these biological control agents are: one, they must target only one or a few species. There have been some cases, one instance of a biological control that I can think of that actually became a problem, and that's the kudzu bug, which was introduced to, of course, control kudzu vines throughout the Southeast, became a problem for soybean growers. These biological controls do need to have a high reproductive rate to be able to manage some of this vegetation. These biological controls must also be effective in finding their target. And again, their life cycle must sync with the target. So when the plant is growing, that biological control must also be present as well. Manual remover probably the most undesirable practice for managing invasive species because it's so labor intensive, involving shovels, saws, pickaxe, a variety of hand tools. With manual removal and invasive species, there are a lot of seedlings and small saplings that can be easily pulled from the ground. But when you do manual removal or even mechanical control, consider what are you going to do after you dispose, or how you're going to dispose of the biomass. Because even some small seedlings can have these tenacious roots that really prevent extractions and break at the root collar. And if left on the ground, a lot of the stems of these invasive species can reroot. So you just can't cut them down and leave them there. They actually have to be taken out of the site. Also, all this pulling and hand weeding can cause extensive soil disturbance. Pulling these well-anchored plants disrupts the soil surface, and this can result in further invasion by other non-native species. Mechanical removal. This is using heavy equipment, anything from bulldozers to mowers, usually used to remove woody plants. Whenever you do a mechanical control, intense follow-up is needed with other control measures once it's completed. Things like herbicide application, re-vegetation. So mechanical control, as you can see from the picture in here, does create a considerable amount of disturbance, and any type of disturbance can lead to additional colonization by weeds and other invasive plants. So again, plans for managing and reestablishing any type of native vegetation, continued herbicide sprays should be carefully thought out when you're using large equipment. Some cultural control tactics, things like prescribed burning. Fire can be used to suppress plant growth and kill plants that are not fire tolerant. If you're using fire to control woody species, they can be reduced, but the effects of fire aren't as noticeable on some of your invasive herbaceous species. Currently, we know very little about the effects of fire on native species, and even less about the effects of fire on invasive species. Also consider, if you're using any type of prescribed burning to manage invasive species, if you have a lot of plants present that you need to eliminate, all that biomass can result in hotter fires and increase the risk of spread. And the effects of a single fire are hard to predict, and you really need to follow up. If you're doing a prescribed burn, you might control all of the above ground biomass or tissue, and you might see resprouts later in the season or even the following year. So considerations for fire and prescribed burning: look at the degree and degradation of the area in question, and consider that anything you do is going to affect all parts of the habitat, including your desired native species. For chemical control, there are a ton of herbicides out there that I know of, but the majority of the herbicides that you're going to use to manage invasive plants are going to be systemic. Those are herbicides that are going to move within the plant to the site where they're active after being absorbed by the foliage, roots, or bark. For a lot of our perennial invasive species, our desire is to actually have that herbicide move from the leaves into perennial storage structures like roots and rhizomes, where they're more likely to provide more of a complete kill over time. Herbicides involved for invasive plant management are things like 2,4-D, aminocyclopyrrochlor, aminopyrrolid, glyphosate, and mazamox, metsulfuron, triclopyr, etc. Again, these are herbicides that are going to move through the plant root. And understanding the persistence and absorption of these herbicides is really important. Things like glyphosate and 2,4-D, they're not going to be very persistent in the soil. In fact, they actually bind to the soils after they're sprayed, so they're not taken up by roots. They have foliar activity only. However, things like aminopyrrolid, mazamox, metsulfuron, some do have foliar and root activity and are readily absorbed by the roots. Herbicides like imazapyr habitat can also damage desirable native species if you're not careful with them, and they are a little bit more persistent in the soil. So with chemical control, we can use several types of applications. One being foliar applications. These are when you apply herbicides directly to the leaf tissues. Most effective on smaller species, ranging from 6 to 8 feet tall. For early season management, we really want to use the auxin type herbicides or group 4 herbicides. These are things like 2,4-D and triclopyr. These are growth regulating herbicides that are going to affect the growth of those plants as they emerge or as they start to flush out new leaves. However, with late summer or early fall applications, we only think about using herbicides like imazapyr habitat or glyphosate-based products, because we really want to be able to translocate that herbicide down into the plant where it's more likely to control those perennial structures or help control those perennial structures. Now, when you're making foliar applications, it's important to remember that complete coverage of all foliage is essential, but you don't want to spray so much that you get runoff, because that's going to reduce effectiveness and you're also going to waste herbicide. Another tip for making foliar applications is to use some sort of tracer dye to make sure you're actually hitting your target plant and not injuring any desired natives in the area. And with foliar applications, multiple follow-up treatments will be likely. Another type of herbicide application is going to be a basal bark application, and these treatments are best for small trees and vines less than 6 inches in diameter. What happens with a basal bark application is you're going to apply a small band of a herbicide plus an oil to the lower 12 to 18 inches of the stem on all sides of the stem, being sure to cover any aerial roots as well. As with a foliar application, you just want to spray enough and avoid runoff. Then one thing about basal bark applications is you're not going to get instant gratification after you make these applications. It does take some time to work. So after you made that one basal bark application, wait about 45 days, then repeat the process about 6 inches above that initial treatment. In addition to basal bark, there's also the hack and squirt tactic. And this is ideal for larger trees that are greater than 6 inches diameter. Basically, with your hack and squirt tactic, you're going to take an axe or a machete, some type of cutting tool, and cut downward at a 45-degree angle. What this does is make a cup for a herbicide solution. Now, for all herbicides you intend to use, I always consult the label for particular product rate. In general, for hack and squirt applications, a herbicide is going to be about 0.5 to about 0.1 milliliters per hack. Good thing about these hack and squirt applications, as well as basal bark applications, is they're very selective. It allows you to treat single species with a particular herbicide without worrying about the effects on native species. However, be aware that when you're making hack and squirt applications, they might not be as effective during certain times of the year, such as in the spring, where you've got a lot of heavy sap flow that may flush out the herbicide. Also, with hack and squirt and basal bark applications, only use these when dead and standing trees are acceptable from a safety and from an aesthetic standpoint. You don't want to have an issue where you successfully manage one of these invasive trees, but have it fall on a hiker or a jogger or something like that. Cut stump treatments are the last type of herbicide treatment I want to cover. These are used after cutting a tree, and you want to eliminate or reduce resprouts or any type of lateral roots. With these cut stump treatments, the herbicide really needs to be applied as quickly as possible after you wipe off that sawdust from the stump. If you can treat the stump immediately, just a simple herbicide water solution will suffice. But if it's delayed for any amount of time after you've cutting, like several hours after you've cut it, you want to include an oil with your herbicide mixture rather than just water. The size of the stump and your cutting is also going to determine how and where you treat it. For stumps greater than 3 inches in diameter, you can successfully treat just the outer edge like we see in this picture. That's because most of the growing tissue is going to be on that outer edge of the stump. But for stumps that are less than 3 inches in diameter, you really need to treat the entire surface. And it really does help to use some type of tracer dye to make sure you're actually treating what you want. So, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, there are a lot of invasive species, but I did want to go through some examples of some invasive species we have here in Maryland and kind of cover the different methods to control them. So, the first species I want to talk about is Callary pear. As you can see from these pictures, Callary pear is, a pretty nice plant, lovely plant to look at. Some background information on Callary pear. It was first introduced in the 1900s for fire blight resistance among 4 common pears. And after that, it was widely used as a rootstock for not only common pear, but it also became a common ornamental. Many of you probably heard of Bradford pear. That's an example of something that developed from this introduction of the Callary pear. Callary pear grows best in full sunlight, but it will tolerate some shading or drought. Unfortunately, Callary pear does tend to form dense thickets, outcompeting native vegetation. It also produces a large amount of seeds that not only that germinate and grow rapidly, making this a pretty big problem for undisturbed areas. And it has a lot of good vegetative growth and can form sizable patches within several years. Another problem with Callary pear is it has very weak branches. So things like high winds are going to knock the branches off of this trees. And if you happen to have Callary pear actually in your yard or in your property, could cause some sizable damage. So control methods for Callary pear. These plants are shallow rooted, and they can be pulled when the soil is moist. As far as chemical control goes, cut stump treatments with these systemic herbicides, glyphosate or triclopyr, are best for medium to large trees. Another species I want to talk about that's kind of iffy on whether it can be considered invasive is the sweetgum. Sweetgum is very pretty tree, nice star-shaped leaves, nice foliage in the fall, but it's actually native to the southeastern US. I used to see a lot of sweetgum growing up, and in my travels going south to the beach, and even where I grew up in Virginia. So we think about invasive species as often coming from foreign locales. This is an invasive species that has come from the United States, and it just seems to be colonizing more of the Northeast. Sweetgum really became popular as a replacement for trees affected by Dutch elm disease. I remember that the previous slide I showed, you saw that nice, vibrant reddish purple foliage. It's an easy tree to grow. It's easy to see why people planted sweetgum. It grows in full sun to partial shade in a wide variety of soils. But sweetgum tends to be resistant to things like fire, heat, drought, soil compaction, and wildlife. Again, great attributes if you're planting a garden weed. Sweetgum does tend to have large, aggressive roots that can disrupt things like concrete. And probably the biggest issue most of us have with sweetgum are these little fruit balls that just seem to be dropped everywhere. So options for managing sweetgum, chemical control. Again, you're going to looking at foliar applications of things like 2,4-D, glyphosate, or imazapyr in the late summer or early fall. Foliar applications can be especially effective during that sapling stage. Cut stump and hack and squirt treatments using similar herbicides are also going to be effective. Biological control, things like webworms, caterpillars, borers, scales are going to help, as well as leaf spots. Sweetgum can be subjected to root rot, as well as iron chlorosis if in highly alkaline soils. All of these biological attributes can help to reduce sweetgum's vigor, but they shouldn't be relied on as a single management tactic. Another interesting thing about when I was looking at research for looking at stuff to manage sweetgum, I found just as much information about planting sweetgum and helping it to thrive as I did controlling it. So it's important to know what you have, where it is, and what a threat it's going to provide. Multiflora rose. Again, very pretty plant, nice showy yellow flowers, very aggressive. Now, multiflora rose was originally introduced in 1866 as a rootstock for ornamental roses. However, in the 1930s, it began to be promoted as a living fence. And any of you who've seen large patches of multiflora rose probably agree with that. Yes, living fence is a great term for it. It's found in forests, fields, forests, prairies, wetlands, a variety of habitats. Multiflora rose does have an aggressive growth pattern. It also has fairly high fruit production, and the seeds are bird dispersed. It just doesn't tend to stay in one area. And these seeds can be long-lived, lasting for several years in the soil before they're eradicated. Multiflora rose, mechanical control is an option for multiflora rose, but it's not going to be a one-time or one-size-fits-all approach. For multiflora rose, you generally want to cut or mow 3 to 6 times per the growing season for about 2 to 4 years to manage these plants. And follow-up treatments are going to be necessary. As I mentioned, the seeds can be long-lived in the soil, and they may be present even after you've removed an entire patch. Chemical control is going to be most effective at the end of the growing season, using these systemic glyphosate-based herbicides. Chemical control, you can use, you can treat the foliage, or freshly cut or the regrowth of the freshly cut stems. It's important to remember when you're using a combination of both mechanical and chemical control is that you allow some type of regrowth to occur before you apply an herbicide. So, for example, if you're going to mow or cut, wait for that plant to regrow, because if you don't have any type of foliage after it's cut, there's going to be no way for that herbicide to get into the plant. Biological control, there's rosette disease, which is actually spread by a native mite that impedes stem growth. There's the European rose chalcid, very interesting creature that is actually a non-native seed-infesting wasp. And if you look at the picture in the center of your screen, here's an example. That wasp is a parasitoid that actually lays its eggs in the seed, and the larvae actually emerge from it. It's pretty cool. And there's also the rose stem girder. Now, I list these as options for biological control of multiflora rose. However, these specimens can also affect native rose populations as well. Multiflora, I want to point out that multiflora rose can be confused with some other similar looking both species, both native and non-native species. One thing about multiflora rose is if you look at the base of the plant, it's going to have fringe stipules at the base of its leaf, and the stems or canes of multiflora rose are usually going to be a vibrant olive green color year-round. Some of our native roses, like pasture roses, are all going to have pink flowers and smooth stipules. Another species that can be confused with multiflora rose are the rubus or blackberry species, but those tend to have purplish canes or stems. Another invasive species that could be confused with a multiflora rose is wineberry. But if you look closely at the wineberry, at the stems of wineberry, they're going to be covered in, a lot of hairs, very dense hairs. Lesser celandine is the next species I want to talk about, and it seems to be more of a recent introduction, or at least a recent problem, because up until a few months ago, I really never heard of this weed as being invasive. But lesser celandine can sound very pretty plant. It resembles some of our native buttercups and is actually a member of the buttercup family. Lesser celandine does reproduce by aerial bulbous, and it has tubers along its roots, which we can see in the picture to the right. So lesser celandine has actually been around for a while. First introduced as an ornamental plant in the 1800s. One of the problems with this species is it's ephemeral. It's a short-lived plant. So by the time you notice you have it, it may have already completed its life cycle. It emerges in late March to mid-April and flowers in late April to mid-May. Again, very quick life cycle, makes it difficult to control, especially for something you're looking at managing seeds and tubers and other reproductive characteristics. It's usually found near bodies of water, or it can also be found in locations with moist soil. And this species does tend to quickly establish along shorelines. Control, lesser celandine can be controlled manually. The problem is you have to dig up all those tubers and remove them, or else it's just going to come back. Chemical control, there aren't really any type of soil type herbicides you can apply to prevent this. Most are going to be post foliar applications made in late March to early April. These applications are going to be most effective when the plants are at about 50% flowering. You can use either selective or non-selective herbicides to control this. Non-selective glyphosate-based herbicides if you're not worried about surrounding vegetation, or you can use more selective herbicides like 2,4-D and triclopyr to control this plant. Also, with lesser celandine, as it tends to grow around bodies of water and moist areas, be sure that the herbicide you're using has an appropriate label and is labeled and is, has an appropriate label for aquatic sites. An example of an aquatic label would be something like using rodeo, which is the glyphosate formulation labeled for aquatic sites. Lesser celandines, another one of these plants that can be confused with our native species. As I mentioned again, lesser celandine is a member of the buttercup family. It's often confused with some of our native marsh marigold plant, but with that plant, it's only going to have about 5 to 9 petal-like sepals, whereas lesser celandine is going to have about 7 to 12 petals that are actually narrower than the marsh marigold. And lesser celandine, if you look at it, it's also going to have bulblets around the stem. Now, lesser celandine can also be confused with some of our common violet species, but those are easily distinguishable once they flower, because lesser celandine is going to have a yellow flower, whereas a lot of our violet species are going to have kind of a purplish or bluish flower. Japanese stiltgrass. Many of you've maybe seen this on hikes, or there's a strong chance that it's starting to invade your lawns.
Lawns?
Japanese stiltgrass was first introduced in this country about 1919, and it's likely escaped. It was introduced primarily as a packing material for porcelain and other fragile items. It thrives well in full sun and deep shaded forest conditions, moist, rich soils that can range in a wide variety of pHs and soils that are high in nitrogen. With Japanese stiltgrass, it spreads quickly, and it really threatens native understory vegetation, especially any native understory vegetation that's trying to grow and develop. It readily invades disturbed areas, floodplains, mowed areas, and any areas where deer traffic is a big deal. Manual control. Japanese stiltgrass is shallow rooted and it's easily pulled by hand. So if you're starting to see small patches appear, just go ahead and pull it out. You know, larger patches, probably not going to be desirable to hand pull everything. With mechanical control of Japanese stiltgrass, your idea is to prevent seed production. Think about mowing versus just simple string trimming. If you use a string trimmer, weed eater, you're going to cut off plants at the ground level and help to remove all the stem tissue, preventing weed growth. Mowing is not as effective as you're not really removing all of that stem tissue, and some regrowth can occur. Flame weeding has been used in some areas, and it's effective in moist sites where there's little fire hazard. Usually want to try to flame in the early spring or late summer. However, with all mechanical operations, you really want to delay these mechanical operations until June. That helps you to avoid that any second flush of germination after you've mowed, string trimmed, or flame weeding. So, right now is the ideal time to control Japanese stiltgrass. However, a second treatment must be completed before the plants produce seed in August. As far as chemical control goes, again, you can make applications of these systemic glyphosate-based herbicides. They're non-selective. You can also make applications of contact herbicides, such as glufosinate or cheetah. This is also going to be a non-selective approach, but if you're using a systemic herbicide like glyphosate compared to a contact herbicide like glufosinate, if you happen to get glufosinate or Cheetah Pro on an undesirable native, you're only going to cause some cosmetic damage. You can also make foliar applications of grass selective herbicides, things like clethodim, select, fluazepop, or cefoxidime, which is post. These grass selective herbicides are only going to control that Japanese stiltgrass, and they can be really advantageous if you're in an area where you have a lot of herbaceous or woody vegetation that you don't want damaged. Japanese stiltgrass can be controlled with pre-emergence herbicide applications. Those are applications made to the soil before plants emerge. Most pre-emergence herbicides will not control plants once they emerged. But using products like Prowl or prodiamine can be effective. You just need to apply these about 2 to 3 weeks before weed germination. For Japanese stiltgrass, that's about mid-March or late February if we're having an early spring. Some herbicides do have both foliar and soil activity, so late pre-emergence applications of imazapic or sulfametron can be made between April and early May. Now, here we have a nice, just a nice brief calendar for managing Japanese stiltgrass and when it's best to make these applications. So we see again that Japanese stiltgrass is going to emerge April and May. So that's really when we want to put that pre-emergence herbicide, that pendimethalin, and that prowl down. But if we happen to miss our window, we can still apply that late post-emergence herbicide during the germination period. Your post-emergence herbicide can be applied, anytime from May to August, as well as you're pulling or you're cutting treatments. But again, remember the idea is to stop that, to remove the plants before that seed production and seed ripening period in late August, early September. A couple notes for managing well-established populations of Japanese stiltgrass. Reseeding of your desirable native plants is going to be essential for long-term control. These efforts really need to be directed towards a temporary suppression and release of these native plants to allow them to become vigorous enough. So you want to kind of slowly replace that Japanese stiltgrass with your desirable native species. Again, allowing that species to, your desirable species to grow and become more competitive with that stiltgrass. And unfortunately, with reseeding of native plants, this really can occur only where the impact of deer on the vegetation is low. Japanese stiltgrass, one last thing I want to mention is it can be confused with a lot of our native or native and invasive grass species. Things like whitegrass, basket grass, or smartweed. A key identifying characteristic of Japanese stiltgrass, however, compared to all of these, is you're going to notice a line of silvery hairs along the midrib. That the basket grass, another invasive species, does tend to look like Japanese stiltgrass, but the leaves are a little bit more crinkled, a little bit more wavy. Smartweed, lady's thumbs also can resemble Japanese stiltgrass, but smartweed is a broadleaf plant. If you look very closely at the area of the area stem where the leaf and petiole meet, there's this kind of membrane called an ochrea that's a characteristic of all members of the smartweed family that you're not going to see with any type of grasses. And for things like smartweed and lady's thumb, you may also notice, a purple thumbprint on the leaf, which you're not going to see with Japanese stiltgrass. So a few final notes I want to talk on, herbicide applications especially, is that we're using systemic herbicides to control a lot of these invasive plants. And if these plants are under any type of stress, it's going to result in reduced transabsorption and translocation. In addition to reduced translocation, plants that are under stress, they're not going to transpire water as quickly. So they're not going to move through the plant. These plants can also have thickened cuticles, which makes it harder for the plant to take in the herbicide, as well as an increased rainfast period, which is the time that you can apply the herbicide for it to be effective before it rains. So ideally, with a lot of these herbicides, you really want to apply the ideal temperatures for applications are going to be anywhere from 65 degrees to 85 degrees. Another issue with herbicides is going to be water hardness. And that's the amount of dissolved cations in water, calcium, magnesium, strontium, etc. Now, what happens is these dissolved cations will actually bind to weak acid pesticides like glyphosate. So pesticide has a negative charge. These cations have a positive charge. Those cations bind to the herbicide in solution and making less herbicide effective to control the plants. Now, in general, what we do working with agricultural weeds will overcome that hard water effect by adding ammonium sulfate. And that sulfate ion actually binds those hard water cations before the herbicide can. Another way to overcome water hardness with herbicides is to use less water. So fewer calcium, and so there are fewer calcium and magnesium ions to tie up the glyphosate. This using less water can be especially beneficial when you're controlling these invasive plants in natural areas, because most of your herbicide solutions are going to be on a percent volume per volume basis rather than just a few like an ounce per acre rate that you would use if you were spraying corn and soybeans. So one final note, again, revegetation is essential for managing these invasive plants. If you just get rid of them and don't put anything desirable in there, you'll get the same invasive plants returning, or you'll get something worse. Some good resources for information for revegetation are going to be, the Maryland Native Plant Society. Some really good resources. This book, Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping, lists a bunch of different species that you could use for revegetation. Also, as I said, with examples with the lesser celedine and with the multiflora rose, it's really important to be able to identify, the difference between our native plants and our undesirable invasive species. And this is a good resource I found here: Mistaken Identity, Native Plants and Their Invasive Lookalikes. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I will try to answer any of the questions you have. I see both the Q&A and the chat has been very active. So,
oh man, yeah, I've been running hard on this one, trying to get a lot of resources out to people. So thank you, Kurt. That was awesome. Yeah, we've had a lot of questions coming in. And we are at the 1 o'clock hour. We understand if you need to leave, but please, you're welcome to stay as long as I'm willing to stay as long as we answer all these questions as much as I can. And as long as Kurt is willing to stay on, maybe we can dive in. You okay to go on a little longer, Kurt?
sure.
Cool. So I'm gonna I've been trying to answer a lot of questions. I've got a list of some things I haven't hit yet. One quick one, tracer dyes. What dye do you use? And can you use just regular food coloring, or what do you recommend for there?
Tracer dyes, they do have specific tracer dyes for herbicide use. I do not recommend food coloring, just because a lot of it's water based, and it's not going to last as long as you might think.
Cool. I saw somebody asked about impacts of some of these herbicides to honeybees. You described some of the insect impacts, and I'm sure that varies by herbicide, and maybe that's the thing. But could you describe maybe some of the common things you might know of?
Yes. Most of the herbicides we use in general are relatively safe for use around honeybees. But with any pesticide application, whether it be a herbicide, insecticide, you kind of want to separate your application from the period that those honeybees are actually foraging. So you can minimize the risk of pesticide injury on honeybees by just not spraying them while they're active.
Cool. One thing that didn't come in the Q&A, I've been putting it in a lot. And one thing I find to be really helpful is to understand the half-life of herbicides. Could you talk a little bit about what that means? And do you tend to look at that when you're thinking about what herbicide to use?
All right. So, the half-life of a herbicide is really going to be how long that herbicide's going to be effective. For a lot for things like glyphosate, 2,4-D, those aren't going to persist for very long in the environment. In fact, again, as I mentioned, glyphosate, once it's sprayed, it binds to the soil. It's not going to be released from the soil and taken up by plants. Things like imazethapyr, habitat, those are going to have a longer half-life, and that's what I meant by a longer residual in the soil. They're going to last. They're going to be present a little bit longer. Most herbicides, just by design, aren't going to have an extremely long half-life because most herbicides are designed to work with agricultural crops, and we have to rotate different crops over time. And if we happen to spray one herbicide that has a long residual and we want to plant like say watermelons or sweet corn and then there's the potential of damaging that next crop. Now, one herbicide I mentioned in this presentation, aminocyclopyrachlor, things like aminopyrrolid, those herbicides are also used in pasture management, and those can have pretty significant half-lives, some over 2 years. So you really want to be careful when you're using these products.
Yeah, I was surprised. I was Googling around. I saw triclopyr as a 3.5-year half-life, which was surprising to me. That it's going to be persisting in the environment for a while.
Yeah, and half-life isn't necessarily the same as having a rotational restriction.
Right.
It might still be in the environment, but is it at a concentration that is high enough to affect the plant?
Gotcha. Great. Yeah, I think it just as a general rule, I always think like, gosh, I want to have something that's just, if it's a poison, I want to have it like gone as soon as possible in general, just as a best practice, right?
And that's the great advantage of using some of these hack and squirt and cut stump treatments, because you're minimizing the amount of herbicide that you're introducing to the environment, and you're saving yourself some money.
Yeah, great. Aquatic formulations and things. Could you describe, somebody mentioned when you had that lesser celedine slide and it's right by water, stiltgrass is oftentimes in creek areas. Can you describe what aquatic formulations do? Are they relatively safe for amphibians and other wildlife? Because I know that's one of the big concerns with herbicides is that amphibians can sometimes be affected by herbicides. Could you describe maybe some of that aquatic issues?
Okay, so when I talk about aquatic formulations, I'll use an example of glyphosate. Now, most of you are probably familiar with Roundup. Roundup is a formulated product of glyphosate, so it contains both glyphosate and a taloamine surfactant. that surfactant is actually what is toxic to that aquatic wildlife. So when we talk about using an aquatic formulation like rodeo, that's just glyphosate that does not have that surfactant that's going to be damaging to the desired wildlife. So
Interesting. So it's the surfactant more than it is the herbicide.
yes, when herbicides go through the screening process, it's not only the active ingredient that's tested, like glyphosate 2,4-D, it's also that formulated product, the Roundup, the rodeo, to see what potential problems exist and how to best apply it to a particular site.
I see. Okay. This came up, Lori Lilly asked, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but I know this is one I was just recently dealing with, is emulsifiers and oils and surfactants that sometimes need to be added into herbicides. And my understanding is it's always on the label. Sometimes it's real, you have to dig in through a long label to find out where that is. Can you describe, like, how common do you need to add a surfactant to your herbicide mix? And Lori asked, what kind of oils are used to mix with the herbicide? I've seen also on the label using certain types of oils. Can you describe, like, when you need to add things like that to herbicides?
First of all, what surfactants do and other adjuvants is they help get that herbicide water droplet into the plant. A lot of times you'll need to use a surfactant where the plant, there might be a lot of hairs on the leaf, or the plant might have a thick cuticle. Anytime you're trying to get that into a plant, a lot of information on surfactants can usually be found on the label. What I do when I need to find out if a label requires a surfactant is I just, open up the label as a PDF and just search surfactant or adjuvant, and it'll tell you. As far as what types of oils are used, most of the time you're using like some type of biologically derived oil, like a methylated seed oil or a soybean oil as a surfactant. You're not necessarily using petroleum as a surfactant.
Right. We're on this topic. Somebody asked about diesel fuel. Is the best place to go is just the label? Is that really where?
Yeah, the best place to go is the label.
Yeah. And it's a pain to get through them. I will say it is a pain to get through them, but they are worth reading carefully. And that's probably maybe one of the biggest things to take away from this.
They are worth reading, and most of the time labels will have specific information on the plant or site you're trying to work with. Now, the Roundup label, any type of glyphosate labels, those are pretty lengthy. Yeah, I will admit that.
Yeah. And a lot of little specific pieces in there. For example, it'll say the height of the plant you're trying to control. I tried clethodim on stiltgrass, which you mentioned, but I think that it had gotten a little bit tall. It was over 6 inches, I think. And I don't think I'm going to get any control on the stiltgrass. So there's a lot of details to be thinking about.
A lot of details. As far as herbicides go, and especially things like, using clethodim, using 2,4-D. For agricultural weeds, we recommend spraying them when they're small, because that label, that recommendation, it is based on research, and the label's the law. So you can't apply more herbicide than the label states. That's why, controlling invasive plants takes time, because you're limited on your rate, and you're just not going to be able to get enough herbicide legally to control these plants.
Right. Gosh, there's a lot of questions coming in. Let's try and get through as many as we can. Here, maybe we can go another maybe 10 minutes or so. See how many we can do. All right, we've got a few coming in. Thank you for hanging in there, everybody. Somebody asked if I would be able to save this chat. Yes, I'll save the chat. I'll send it around with the recording to everybody later. Okay. Terry asked, is there a resource listing the most effective herbicides for invasives, non-native or native? And we talked about this a little bit beforehand. It doesn't seem like there's like a one go-to resource out there that you're aware of.
No, not not as far, not that I know of. The University of Maryland doesn't have like a single resource, detailing efficacy on these herbicides in different native and non-native plant. Penn State has some good information on some specific species. Again, the University of Florida Center for Aquatic Invasive Plants, they have a list of control measures for a variety of species. They do have some efficacy tables listed, but some of those species are present more in Florida than not necessarily for us here in Maryland and the Northeast.
Yeah, and everybody here, I would say, your extension agencies, I usually use Google, and I've just been searching around with all the questions that are coming through. And I would say generally your extension services are going to have good information from a trusted source. And so you can always go to that. And I usually put in the plant herbicide and then scroll through the results and look for something from an extension service. That's one of my approaches.
Yeah, and most of the herbicides you're going to be used are going to be the same ones we've talked about: glyphosate, 2,4-D, triclopyr.
Yep.
And
So
most
maybe
and it's really going to be time of year when these applications are going to be more effective rather than just the herbicides themselves.
Yeah. Great. Doug asked early on, the Maryland General Assembly passed legislation about strengthening invasive plant control. Do you know anything about that new law?
I've heard about it, but I'm not that familiar with it.
Yeah.
I do know that we are trying to hire a native plant specialist here at the university.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I think there was an effort to kind of label or prevent certain things from being sold in nurseries.
Yes.
Well, tricks for non-native wisteria. I'm gonna venture a guess on this one. I would probably do a cut stump treatment on it with a herbicide that would work on it. Do you know anything? Any suggestions on that one?
Yeah, for vines, the non-native wisteria, your cut stump treatment is probably going to be your most practical approach, because it's probably vining up a desirable tree you want to have in your yard, and you of course can't do a foliar application is not going to be an option. So yes, the cut stump treatment is probably going to be your best for looking at wisteria.
Yeah. All right, great. Thank you. Get through these. Okay, let's see what else we have. Somebody was asking about whether there's a reformulation of Roundup and whether Roundup is no longer toxic to fish. Is rodeo even still available? Is that old stuff?
Rodeo is still available.
Yep.
Again, it's the tallow component, the surfactant component that's in the Roundup formulation that's toxic to fish. It's not the Roundup that's going to be toxic.
Gotcha. Good to know. Tree of Heaven and Oriental Bittersweet. I think those are probably going to be also cut basil bark or cut stump treatment.
Basil bark or cut stump. Another thing about doing basil bark treatments, not only do you want to have relatively thin trees, but basil bark treatments aren't going to be really effective on trees that have thick bark.
Good. And one of the nice things about that sort of cut stump or hack and squirt method is it's a very targeted application of the herbicide. So you're only going to hit that one plant. It's a really nice way to not really be spreading a lot of it around in the environment. And Oriental Bittersweet, I would think that would be a similar mix. I would probably Google it and make sure the herbicide you're using will be effective. But oftentimes Roundup is a pretty good one for those treatments. We had somebody ask about clethodim fluazifop. That was on the Penn State publication as a grass selective, and sethoxidum. I'm not so sure about sethoxidum, but I think clethodim and fluazifop are grass selectives. So those would not kill wildflowers and broadleaf plants.
No, those
Correct.
will not kill wildflowers and broadleaf plants.
Yep.
Another thing about those grass selective herbicides is, again, is they may take about 7 to 14 days to show any type of injury.
All right. Good to know. Are there best management practices to present to local governments who are likely to shy away from pesticide use on public lands? I think you have a lot on your website. I'm going to actually put a link to your website because you have a lot of good stuff on there.
Yeah.
I would say yes. I think there's some pretty good resources out there. I'm going to share a link to Kurt's website. And I think a lot of natural resources agencies, you know, I understand the desire to not use herbicides, and that there's sort of a feeling of not wanting to put poisons in the environment. But I think when it comes to some of these invasive species, I've kind of come around to understanding like there's no way we're going to be able to control these through other means.
It's a balancing act. You know, these invasive species spread rapidly. You can use non-chemical means to control them, but how often are you going to have to use these non-chemical means? Is it going to be affordable from a land manager perspective? And is it just compared to the efficacy of using herbicides versus having to come in with large equipment or mow week after week after week? It's an interesting debate.
Yeah. And there are impacts from some of that mowing as well. And yeah, just feasibility of the cost. I've tried pulling stiltgrass for years. It's still coming back. I suspect with stiltgrass as well is that those seeds in the seed head inside the plant are viable. I suspect they're viable even before they're visible. I wait every summer. I've been trying for years to wait until I see that any single plant has a single seed head, and I pull it out and I kill it all around the whole yard, down to the ground. And it's still coming back 3 or 4 years later now. And I'm thinking maybe some of those seed heads are inside the stalk and they're still potentially viable. I've been meaning to test that, but I haven't gotten around to it. But there's so many coming back that I'm thinking there's got to be viability in some of these seeds. So hearing some things about policy is Maryland State Highway Association have a like an invasive species policy. I'm not aware of it. I don't think they're planting invasives anymore. I think in the past that has happened. I don't know if you know anything about state highway plantings.
No, I do not.
Yeah. I would, Karen and Terry, I think I'd reach out to your local, folks, may reach out to the state highway and let them know your public feedback. Thistles, anything on thistles, I would think that'd be a 2,4-D application and the right way.
A stinger is a herbicide product we use to eradicate thistles. Yeah, something that's broadly selected.
Great. Great. I think we may have missed some in here. There's been a lot in the chat. This has probably been one of our most active chats that I've seen. Milestone was mentioned by Jared Edwards. Thanks to Vicky for another one for thistle.
Yeah, and Milestone is the aminopyrrolid I mentioned earlier. Great broadleaf herbicides. Fairly long rotational restriction to most desirable crops and plants.
Good to know about. Barry just asked any option to spot spray Roundup on Lespedeza and CRP. Do you know about CRP restrictions, Kurt, much?
No, I'm not. No,
I would always check with the NRCS or your CRP contractors and all that stuff, because there's laws and all that. Would it be effective against Lespedeza? I assume he's talking about Korean Lespedeza.
Yeah, you should see some effect of glyphosate on Lespedeza. It's a legume, and
Right.
like you said, yeah, if you can spot spray, that will help to control it. But again, spot sprays, depending on how big your population is, may not be the most desirable thing to do.
Yeah, and he's responding right now. Yeah. Question is that can you get something that's just very selective for Lespedeza? And I think the most selective you'd probably get is a broadleaf and broadleaf herbicide that would kill all your wildflowers.
Yeah, something like 2,4-D.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're getting a lot of thank yous. Hucklebuck, he asked about tricks to identify invasive versus natives. There are various apps. I have learned so much using my phone I use the Seek app. There's another one called Picture This that I think you have to pay for. I've learned so many plants from that. It's not 100%, but it gets me 95% of plants that I'm interested in. And it tells me right there if it's invasive or native. So that's the one I'd recommend.
Yeah,
So.
Picture This has been one of the best apps to use.
Do you use that yourself? Is that the one you use? Do you use one?
Yeah, and I think, in fact, I think Picture This might have actually been had a paper published on it. I remember in one of the weed science journals, they looked at several of these identification apps, and some of them are obviously better than others, but not all apps are right where they need to be. Sometimes you just take a picture and it just says plant.
Yeah. Or it'll tell me it's a I forget what's whatever. Yeah, it'll tell me it's like some basic type of plant. Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you. We've had a lot of some more things coming in the chat. Please, everybody, feel free to take a look at that stuff. Thank you for joining. Thanks for staying long, Kurt. This was a really good Q&A session, and I think we'll have to have you back on some more stuff in the future. This has been good.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. We'll look forward to seeing you next month. Hopefully, we talk about Canada geese. So bring your questions and curiosity, and we'll talk to you then. Take care.
Everybody have a good afternoon.
Take care. Bye-bye.